So we're going to go to our next presentation now, which is exploring the accessibility of an online self-help psychological intervention for MND. And I'd like to welcome Cathryn Pinto to share your presentation with us.
My name is Cathryn. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Southampton. And today I'm going to talk to you about my PhD project, which developed and evaluated an online resource for psychological support in MND, and just share some of the findings and the things that I've learned through doing this piece of work. So the overall aim was to develop an online resource or a website for psychological support that both people who have MND and family members could both use. And we used a very collaborative approach called the person-based approach, which basically includes interviews with people at different stages of development and evaluation and incorporates their feedback to changes that were made in the website. And the reason we picked a website to provide support was so that it would be easy to use for people whenever they felt like it. Some people may always prefer talking to someone or talking to a therapist, but this was mainly to fill the gap when access to psychological support is difficult. So we initially did some interviews with people with MND and family members, and they told us that 3 things were important for well-being, and that was hope and positivity, a sense of control, and compassion, both self-compassion, so taking it easy on yourself when things are difficult, as well as compassion from other people and healthcare professionals. We've just published some of the findings from this work, so if you want to look at it in more detail, the details of the paper are on the screen. From these interview findings, we learned that any information we put on the website needed to be positive and empowering and focus on the things that could be done. Also, the types of activities we included needed to be applicable to people who had different levels of ability and different symptoms. Because a sense of control was also important, the website had to be flexible to use, and people could choose which sections they wanted to look at, and there was no fixed format or fixed number of sessions that you had to complete. We also used advice and techniques from mindfulness, acceptance and commitment therapy, and compassion-focused therapy. I will just briefly show you a couple of pages from the website. So we call the website Coping and Living Well with MND, or CALM for short. So this is the CALM homepage, and you can basically choose which section you'd like to look at based on the problem or difficulty you were facing at the moment. So there is a building positivity section, an adjusting to changes section, dealing with worry and stress, and an all activities section where you can jump directly to any activity that you found useful from the website. And also an other support section which pointed you to other helpful resources and places for support beyond this website. So there were different ways you could use the website. For example, in the building positivity section, there were 3 different activities that you could do to stay positive, or you could choose an emotion that you were struggling with at the moment. So in the page shown on your screen, it's frustration, and accordingly that would point you to either a suggested activity or practical tips, or you could hear about how other people have coped with frustration, both from the perspective of the person who had MND as well as the family member or carer. We then evaluated the website with 2 rounds of feedback. In the first round, we went through the website page by page with people and asked for their immediate impressions and then used their feedback to make any changes. In the second round, people used the website for 6 weeks, and we then did interviews at the end of that period and asked people whether they liked it or they didn't, and what specific advice or suggestions they found helpful. So in the first round, we conducted 14 Think Aloud interviews, and this was some of the feedback that we received. So some of it was about making changes to the presentation and the navigation so that it was easier for people to use. We also added more examples to make it more relevant to family members as well. And we had some mixed responses about using photographs of people. Some people thought it would make it more relatable and engaging, but sometimes photographs of people who have certain symptoms or were at a more advanced stage could be difficult for people to look at. So we haven't really solved this problem yet, but for the moment we tended to use fewer images so as not to upset people. But again, this could have potentially impacted how engaging the website was. And in some places in the website, we would list suggestions of activities you could do and presented it as a list, so you could choose what activity suited you. But we soon learned that this was actually triggering for people because it acted as a reminder of the things that you could no longer do. So we've now presented them as stories or examples that people can relate to based on their situation rather than lists. We also tried to make some of the wording or the phrasing more realistic for MND. So for example, acknowledging that certain things might be difficult to do, for example, thinking of positive things, or saying things like you may need to repeat an activity a couple of times in order to experience the benefit from this. In round 2, after people had used the website for some time, we then asked them questions about what they used and how they used the different techniques. And this was largely exploratory work because we didn't know if people might find something like this helpful. So we included a range of people, some written interviews as well, so people who had difficulties with speech could also take part. And there was also a huge age range and consequently different levels of familiarity with using technology. People who were recently diagnosed took part, as well as those who had MND for several years. And we also included people with a range of physical and psychological symptoms, and also a few who had cognitive symptoms. And the basic aim was to see whether support and advice like this was applicable to a wide range of people. I will just share some of the feedback that we got from the interviews. So we got a lot of positive feedback in terms of the technical aspects of the website. It was helpful in the way we anticipated, where it provided some support to people who may not necessarily have been able to access other psychological support. So the first quote you see on the screen is from someone who has been diagnosed fairly recently. And she says, because that is the problem at the moment, everything is virtual. You haven't got anybody there to sort of talk to. You can't join any groups, and so it has been harder. But say going onto the website and just going through little bits and reading what other people have said, that has helped. Similarly, people have said that the website was fairly easy to use. The second quote on your screen is from a family member, but we've got similar feedback from people with MND as well, who've said that you don't have to be very familiar with technology. The information is not too overwhelming, and you could use it, say, if you haven't got a lot of dexterity in your hands or through eye gaze technology. And in general, people liked that you could pick things that suited you from the website. We got a lot of varied feedback in terms of which things people liked, and which things they didn't. Mindfulness was one of those where people had quite strong opinions about whether they liked it or not. But at the same time, having different suggestions gave people a chance to pick things that suited them best. And largely people would look at the website in their spare time, not necessarily if they were struggling with particular emotions. I'll just read the quote on your screen. The person says, "I think if you were frustrated or upset, to then start and get your iPad out or your phone or whatever you access it through, you don't always feel like it at that moment in time. So I found it all therapeutic to do in my spare time, and then if upset at some points in the day, I have just sat and remembered what was on the audio." Although we tried to make things easy and simple to use, and this was generally appreciated, some people would have liked more range and depth of information. The first quote talks about wanting more activity options so you can mix things up. But also the depth of information. So in the second quote, the person is talking about the values and goals activity, where you identify something that is important to you and find new ways of doing this based on your level of ability. And she describes how jumping to the technique itself was not as helpful because there was a bit before about dealing with acceptance and grief. I'll just read the quote out. She says, "My life revolved around walking with various groups of friends, going out, dancing. I used to ice skate, cycle, go to the gym all the time. My life has to change completely, and I have to acknowledge the grief saying goodbye to all the things I can't do." So there isn't very much on the website about dealing with the grief of letting go of your previous life and your hopes for the future. The same person went on to use the technique successfully, but there might be something we need to add to help people get to that stage of being able and being ready to actually use the technique. Similarly, we were wondering whether people at a certain stage of the disease would find it more helpful. And in general, people preferred to have this support at an earlier stage, but it still depended more on the person's level of acceptance and readiness rather than stage of the disease. These are two quotes from family members, and in the first quote, the person talks about preferring to have support like this earlier on, but the second quote, the person says they didn't try some of the activities and that they were not ready for this kind of support just yet. So it really depends on the person's level of readiness and acceptance rather than what stage of the disease they're at. These are some examples of people who found the advice and techniques useful. The first person is talking about this technique called the stop technique, which is used to sort of distance yourself from negative thoughts. So the quote at the top says, "I fell on Sunday actually, and my husband sort of came running in. And I said, right, you just got to stop now because I need to get my head together before we start trying to get me up. So I stopped, took a few minutes to sort of collect my thoughts and then progressed to help him to help me up." This person described how she would usually panic in a situation like this, but the technique helped her with this. In the second quote, the person is talking about the self-compassion section. They say, I found it helped me through a tough time I was having recently when I was introduced to rig tube feeding and experienced adverse side effects. This section and activities allowed me to look at and change my thinking. I feel I'm not a strong person to cope with the disease other people cope. And the message in the website around not being too hard and critical of yourself really helped her with this. So from the feedback we've received, we've got some work to do to refine and make improvements to the website. But we also need to do some work about how to introduce support like this to people, because views and expectations were so varied. and also how to implement self-help online support like this in clinical practice. I've put my contact details on the screen if you'd like any more information about the project, and thank you for listening.
So Cathryn, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that's really, really interesting. And actually some of the comments in the chat are saying it's very much reflecting on the previous speakers and who that person is, the essence of the person. Looking at questions, I have a question, and I just looked at your group of people that you are asking, and the age range was quite significant. Did you find any difference from, and again, things we were talking about yesterday, tying into people who are maybe older and less used to websites and the technology that some of the younger people might be using? I speak for myself as one of those. So just wondering if in your feedback and your results you found that age actually had an effect.
Yeah, I didn't actually find that age had a massive effect. But I also think part of it was because this coincided with when COVID happened and lockdowns and things like that. So I think a lot of people started to get more familiar with using technology as well. So that may have skewed the results of the study slightly. But I think even through doing this work with people in the Think Aloud interviews, we sort of made it as easy as possible. So it was almost like operating any website, really. Yeah.
That's great. And I love who came up with the name Calm. I think that is an excellent name for the website.
Thank you.
Very clever. And I think that's, I suppose it's depending on how you wanted the site to be used, because I guess people aren't necessarily going to use it when they are in the middle of an event or when they are particularly upset. What was the background? What was your thinking, and how people would actually use this kind of as a therapy?
Yeah, so it was interesting to see how different people used it. I think people tended to use it more, not necessarily when they were upset, but it also kind of, you need to almost preempt that you may have certain problems with dealing or adjusting to certain things, and then look at the ahead of that almost. So there was a slight difference where some people kind of looked at the website and maybe thought, I don't need this information just yet. Whereas others kind of read it and said, okay, so now I know what's there. So when I do face a problem, I know where to go, how to use it. So those were the slightly different ways people used it. Yeah, I don't know which one's better or not. It's just kind of how people feel ready at that time.
No, I think it's tricky, isn't it? Having one tool, it doesn't fit everybody all the time, but it sounds like an amazing resource. If I understand you're doing a little bit more work about the introduction and the implementation of it, but do you think this will be available for people to use in the future?
Yes, that is what I'm hoping. I did see some of the comments on the chat about the URL, and I don't have it at the moment because we kind of used the website in the context of the research study to test it out. So it needs still some refinement before I can kind of make it more public. But the hope is that eventually it will be available for people to use. Yeah.
Well, I think we're really excited, and if you could keep the Alliance informed of that, because I think that's a lovely way of spreading the word, because it's a fantastic resource, and not everybody has access to psychology and psychologists. So this is a very positive self-help tool. So thank you so much, Cathryn. And can you also keep an eye on the chat, because there's lots of comments, lovely comments and questions for you, and maybe you can continue to answer them offline.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.